For generations, my family has had a secret. We call it the crucible, a tradition where the patriarch pushes his son to the breaking point to forge him into a man. I always believed it was an honor. But when I, a chef, finally stepped out of my famous father's shadow to open my own restaurant, I learned the truth. The tradition wasn't about making me stronger. It was a horrifying, calculated game of sabotage designed to ensure I would never eclipse him. What do you do when your greatest hero is secretly your greatest enemy? You have to listen to the end to hear how a single dinner service exposed a lifetime of lies and served up the coldest dish of all, the truth. If you enjoyed this video or found it helpful, go ahead and give it a like. It really helps me out. And if you haven't already, hit that subscribe button so you don't miss any future videos. Thanks a bunch. The smell of failure is surprisingly specific. It's not the dramatic scent of smoke or ash. It's the cloying, sickly sweet smell of 50 pounds of prime, dry-aged beef slowly turning in the low-country heat. That was the smell that greeted me when I walked into the kitchen of my own restaurant. Hearth, 2 days before our grand opening. The walk-in freezer, my most expensive piece of equipment, was silent. Inside, everything. The meticulously prepared stocks, the hand-rolled pasta, the heritage pork I'd driven 3 hours to procure, was ruined. Thousands of dollars and hundreds of hours of my life's work were now just garbage. My first call was to my father. It was instinct, a reaction carved into my psyche over 30 years of being his son. For as long as I can remember, Julian Croft wasn't just my dad. He was the Julian Croft, the culinary titan of Charleston, South Carolina. His flagship restaurant, Croft's Table, was a temple of Southern fine dining, a place where politicians and celebrities came to be seen. I grew up in his shadow, learning at his side, eventually becoming the head chef who ran his kitchens while he glad-handed guests out front, collecting James Beard Awards and bathing in the glow of the media spotlight. He was my hero and my jailer. And Dad, something terrible happened, I said, my voice tight with panic. And the walk-in at Hearth went down. Everything's lost. I expected sympathy. I expected the booming, confident voice that had always calmed my fears, even when it was the source of them. Instead, there was a pause, a thoughtful, calculating silence. "Well, son," he finally said, his voice smooth as butter. "Jan, this is it. The crucible." I was wondering when it would begin. The crucible, the most horrifying tradition in our family, dressed up in the noble robes of character building. It was the mythic trial every Croft man apparently had to endure. My grandfather, he told me, had his fishing boat mysteriously sink the day before a huge tournament he was favored to win. My father's first solo business venture, a small catering company, was supposedly gutted by a fire of unknown origin. The stories were always the same. A catastrophic, unforeseen disaster that tested their mettle. And after they overcame it, their real success began. It was our family's creation myth. A story I now realize was a meticulously crafted piece of psychological warfare. "This isn't the crucible, Dad," I snapped, the rage starting to burn through the panic. "Someone left the circuit breaker off." "This was deliberate. Don't get paranoid, Leo," he chided, his tone shifting to that familiar, patronizing calm. "The world isn't out to get you. Sometimes things just happen. A real man, a Croft man, doesn't point fingers. He cleans up the mess. This is your test. Don't disappoint me." She hung up, leaving me standing in the wreckage of my dream, the stench of his gaslighting filling my lungs. Disappoint him. That was always the core fear, wasn't it? For years I had been the dutiful son, the engine of his empire. I developed the menus, I trained the staff, I worked 16-hour days. He took the bows. I accepted it because I believed in the family, in the legacy. I told myself it was codependency in the service of a greater goal. But a year ago, I'd finally decided I wanted something of my own. Not a grand palace like his, but a small, intimate place. 28 seats, an open kitchen. A place focused on the simple, rustic food I loved, not the overly intellectualized plates he was famous for. I wanted to build something that was mine, from the ground up. When I told him, he smiled. It was a thin, tight smile that didn't reach his eyes. Ambitious was all he said. But in the weeks that followed, the subtle sabotage began. The banker he'd highly recommended suddenly found endless problems with my loan application. location. The prime location he'd helped me scout was mysteriously sold out from under me to a developer he played golf with. He'd frame it all as bad luck, as the normal hardships of business, all while telling me, maybe you're just not ready for this, son. There's no shame in staying here with me. He was trying to make me feel helpless, to make me believe that the world outside his protection was too scary, too difficult for me. But I pushed through. I secured my own financing from a credit union. I found a different location in a grittier, up-and-coming neighborhood. I was doing it despite his help. And now, the freezer. This wasn't a test from the universe. This was a message from him. The only person who seemed to understand was Arthur Vance. Arthur was Charleston's most feared and respected food critic. His reviews in the city paper could make or break a restaurant overnight. He was an old friend of my father's, but he'd taken a surprising interest in my project. He'd come by the space during construction, offering quiet words of encouragement. "Your father's a brilliant man, Leo," Arthur had told me over coffee one afternoon, "but his shadow is long. It takes courage to step out of it. Don't let him, or anyone, make you doubt yourself." His support felt like a lifeline. He saw me as a chef in my own right, not just an extension of my father. After the freezer incident, he was my first call after I hung up with my dad. His reaction was the polar opposite. He was furious on my behalf. "That's not a crucible, Leo. That's a crime," he growled into the phone. "Don't you let him get in your head. You call your suppliers. You tell them what happened. You get this place open. I'm moving your review to opening night. I'll make sure everyone in this city knows that a new Croft is in town, and that he's got more grit than his old man ever did." His words were the fuel I needed. For the next 48 hours, I lived on adrenaline and caffeine. I called in every favor. My friends and my girlfriend, Clara, rallied around me. We cleaned, we prepped, we restocked, we worked through the night, a frantic, desperate ballet of chopping and searing. We were going to open. I was going to pass this so-called test and shove it right down my father's throat. On the morning of the opening, a small, unmarked envelope was slipped under the front door. Inside was a single key and a note, typed on my father's signature cream-colored stationery. "Every lock has a key. A wise man knows which doors to keep shut. Dad." It was the key to the main circuit breaker panel in the restaurant's basement. A panel only a few people had access to. A panel I had shown my father on a proud tour just last week. The mask was off. This wasn't a test. This was a threat. And I knew, with a certainty that chilled me to the bone, that the crucible wasn't about overcoming disaster. It was about surviving him. If you enjoyed this video or found it helpful, go ahead and give it a like. It really helps me out. And if you haven't already, hit that subscribe button so you don't miss any future videos. Thanks a bunch! The revelation of the key changed everything. It was no longer a suspicion, it was a confession in brass and steel. My father hadn't just allowed a disaster to happen, he had orchestrated it. The most horrifying tradition in our family wasn't a test of strength. It was a campaign of psychological abuse designed to break the air, to ensure he never challenged the king. My grandfather's boat, my father's catering business. Were those stories even real? Or were they just fables he told to normalize his own cruelty, to make me believe this was a noble trial, and not the pathetic act of a narcissist terrified of being surpassed? For a moment I considered canceling the opening, just shutting it all down. The learned helplessness he'd instilled in me was a powerful drug. His voice was in my head, whispering that I couldn't win, that he was too powerful, that this was all a mistake. But then I looked around my kitchen. I saw the faces of the young cooks who had put their faith in me. I thought of Clara, who had spent the last 2 days scrubbing floors and polishing glasses by my side. And I thought of Arthur Vance, the one powerful man in this city who seemed to be in my corner. His promise to be there on opening night to give me a fair shot was the one thing my father couldn't control. I had to go on. That night, the restaurant was buzzing. The air hummed with nervous energy and the scent of roasting garlic and rosemary. Every seat was filled. And in the corner booth holding court was my father. He had come not with my mother, but with Arthur Vance. They were sitting together, my father looking regal and proud as if he were the host. He caught my eye from across the room and gave me a small, knowing nod. A nod that said, "Dance, puppet, dance." The dissonance was dizzying. He was the arsonist and the fire chief, all in one. I felt a surge of adrenaline. This was my house. my stage, my food. The first few courses went out flawlessly. The energy was electric. I could feel the momentum building. Then, around 9 o'clock, Clara came into the kitchen, her face pale. "Leo, you need to see this," she whispered, handing me her phone. She had opened an email, but it was the attachment that mattered. It was a PDF, an invoice from a private investigator to Arthur Vance. The date was from 3 months ago. The line item read, "For professional services rendered, surveillance of Leo Croft and detailed reporting on Hearth Restaurant development." The amount was $10,000. Below it was a note confirming the payment had been routed through one of my father's shell corporations. The floor fell out from under me. Arthur, my mentor, the man whose encouragement had been my shield. He wasn't my ally, he was a spy. His praise, his advice, the coincidental visits, it was all an act. He was feeding my father information, helping him calibrate his campaign of sabotage. The planned review for tonight wasn't meant to celebrate me. It was meant to be a public execution, written by a trusted critic who knew all my weaknesses because I had handed them to him myself. I was in a trauma bond with a man I thought was my friend, all orchestrated by my father. I looked out from the pass, through the heat haze of the grills. I saw Arthur laughing at something my father had said. He looked over at me and raised his glass in a toast. The betrayal was so profound, so complete, it almost felt abstract. This was the real crucible, not the broken freezer. This, realizing you are utterly and completely alone, surrounded by enemies disguised as friends. In that moment, something inside me didn't break, it clarified. The anger and hurt coalesced into a single cold point of light. I wasn't going to scream. I wasn't going to fail. I was going to do the one thing he never taught me to do. I was going to tell the truth. I untied my apron and walked out into the dining room. The low hum of conversation slowly died down as people noticed me. I walked directly to my father's table. "Good evening, everyone," I said, my voice surprisingly calm and clear. "Before the final course, I'd like to add a little something to the menu. A bit of a story." I looked at my father. The smug smile on his face flickered. Arthur shifted uncomfortably in his seat. "Most of you know my father, Julian Croft," I continued, my voice echoing in the silent room. "You know him as a legend. I know him as the man who taught me how to cook. The first dish he ever taught me was a simple mushroom risotto. I was 8 years old. I nodded to my sous chef, who brought out a small bowl of risotto and placed it in the center of the table. He told me it was my own creation. He had me serve it to a food critic who was visiting our home. The critic raved about it. The next month it appeared on the cover of a national food magazine, under the headline, "Julian Croft Reinvents a Classic," and my name was nowhere to be found. He told me it was a lesson in humility. A murmur went through the room. My father's face was like stone. "Our next course tonight," I announced, as my staff began bringing out plates, "is a deconstructed bouillabaisse. A few years ago, I created a version of this for him. He called it unfocused and pedestrian. 6 months later, it won Croft's table its 3rd James Beard Award. He told me it was a lesson in perseverance." I let the words hang in the air. I went on, course by course, story by story. Each plate was a piece of my history he had stolen, minimized, or erased. I laid bare the narrative of my life that he had so carefully controlled, exposing the truth behind his curated image. I didn't raise my voice. I didn't accuse. I just told my stories. Finally, I picked up the invoice from Clara's phone, which I now held. "And for the final taste of the evening," I said, looking directly at Arthur Vance, whose face had gone a ghastly shade of white. "A lesson in loyalty. It seems some critics have a price. This one is $10,000. I placed the phone on the table in front of him. The silence in the room was absolute. It was the sound of a reputation turning to dust. I looked at my father, truly looked at him, for the first time without fear or need. I saw a small, insecure man, terrified that the world would discover he was a fraud. He had built his kingdom on my back, and the foundation was now crumbling. "The crucible is over, Dad," I said softly. "This is me, cleaning up the mess." I turned and walked back into my kitchen, leaving him to sit in the ruins of the story he had spent a lifetime writing. The next day, the story wasn't about the food at Hearth. It was about the drama. But in the weeks that followed, something amazing happened. People came. They came out of curiosity at first, but they stayed for the food. They stayed because they connected with the story of a son stepping out of a father's shadow. I had formed a boundary, a wall of truth he could not breach. Hearth is now booked out months in advance. I never spoke to my father or Arthur Vance again. The family is broken, but I am, for the first time, whole. I didn't need to pass my father's horrifying test. I just needed to write my own menu, tell my own story, and finally, be my own man.